Professional runners and coaches figured this out a long time ago, and thanks to training science guru Professor Stephen Seiler, amongst others, who published a review of elite training characteristics in the Journal of Sports Medicine, it should be glaringly obvious what you can do to change in your training so that you can run more and become a faster runner. Because across the hundreds of training diaries that the researchers reviewed, they come from the likes of Kipchoge, Bekele, Jeffrey Mutai, Stefan Hassan, as well as coaches of Jack Daniels, Arthur Lydiard and Bill Bauman, to name a few, there was one single training characteristic used by all of the world's best marathon runners. It was the same thing one of my clients used to go from the couch to 60 miles a week in less than 5 months without any injuries. First, I want to address a major problem that we as runners have. We always think in absolute numbers. When I started running, all I thought was 40 minutes for 10K, 60 Ks a week, 20K long run, and 5 by 1K, under 3 minutes 30 for each rep on 1 minute recovery. The thing is, none of these numbers correlated to anything I'd measured. They were just hopes, dreams, desires, and a recipe for disappointment and overtraining. The mistake I continuously see amateur runners making is when they're comparing their training to their friends or anyone faster than them, including the pros, as they're looking at the absolute outputs. They look at a 2-hour long run and they're going, oh shit, he's running pretty fast. Maybe I should step up my game for my 2-hour long runs. Well, here's a quote from Seiler's review of hundreds of professional runners and coaches' training regimes. The most consistent training intensity characteristic of elite distance runners is most of their training, greater than 80%, is performed at a low intensity throughout the training year. In line with previous research, most of this training is executed in zone 1. And the duration of the easy runs is very stable throughout the year. Remember, this is the best runners in the world. And so when I looked through everything, training distribution above zone 2 was quite varied. And when you're comparing, it's like, well, this person's in competition, this person's out of competition, coming back from injury. And as you know, there's the Norwegian method, there's polarization. So above zone 2, there were large discrepancies, but one common theme stayed across every single system, and that was slow zone 1 running. That's where absolute and relative intensity are going to be super important when we're comparing ourselves to others, because you, me, and Kipchoge can all run a zone 1 run, but our pace outputs are going to be completely different. To provide an example, I'm going to take Kipchoge's numbers and a sub 3-hour marathon runner's numbers. Now, the researchers use percentage of maximal heart rate along with some other measures to set their 7-zone system. I also use a 7-zone system, but I use lactate threshold. Now, I don't have anyone's maximal heart rate numbers, but I do have an inference of their threshold. So Kipchoge's is going to be around 250 minutes per kilometer, and a sub 3-hour marathon runner should be around a 4-minute K or around a 620 odd minutes per mile. Using those numbers, I can make up the 7 zones and use a percentage of that to figure out zone 1. And in doing that as a comparison to the maximal heart rate 7-zone system that the researchers use, mine's pretty close. Let's take a look at your standard weekend long run. According to the research, for pro runners, there's going to be 30 to 40 kilometers at about 75% of their lactate threshold. For a Kipchoge, there's around 4 minutes per K or mid 620 minute per mile. For a 3-hour marathon runner, there's going to be around a 520 minute per K or 8-minute mile. Are you running that slow for your long runs? Because in both scenarios, each of those runners, Kipchoge and the 3-hour marathon runner, is running at 75% of their lactate threshold. But that's just their long run. Elite runners will typically run that closer to their zone 2. Their easy runs are done far slower than that. According to the research, they're going to run those around 4:30 to 5 minutes per K, high 7s minute per mile. That's around 57 to 63% of their lactate threshold. If we ever look at that 3-hour marathon runner, that's going to be equivalent to running 6:20 to 7 minutes per K, or 10:15 to 11:20 minute mile. Are you ever running slower than 11-minute mile if you're close to a 3-hour marathon? But let's imagine you did run a lot of your runs slower than an 11-minute mile, or around 7 minutes per K. How do you think you'd feel the next day? probably pretty good. You'd probably think, yeah, I could smash a session after doing an 11-minute mile for an hour. And I bet you'd probably be able to log more miles on average without burnout or injury. And that's exactly what a client of mine did when he started running. He just started running as slow as kind of possible and just kept clocking up and getting up to 60 miles a week, around close to 100 Ks a week in 5 months without any injury, and consistently has been getting faster. Endurance rewards consistency. Chronic consistent stimulus leads to adaptation. Running slowly specifically applies an aerobic demand on our cardiovascular, metabolic, and muscle systems that they must adapt to, thereby becoming more aerobically efficient, enhancing our overall aerobic capacity. Our fitness. The chronic and consistent part, which is so important to the fitness equation, can be helped by running slowly because it reduces the impact loading through our skeletal system, muscles, and tendons, which minimizes our overall risk of injury and needing time off of running. And the European Journal of Applied Physiology has shown that just by running at any speed, the neurological adaptations to running makes us more efficient in the movement of running itself, lowering our overall energetic cost of running at any speed. So we just become more efficient by doing the action. Now, before you throw shade at me for trying to ruin your Strava game with all this slow running, it is important to note that elite runners are running 100 to 140 miles a week. That's 160 to over 200 Ks across 11 to 14 sessions each and every week. You're not doing that. So there is an argument to be made that you should be trying to maximize the stimulus of your aerobic runs, not minimize it, and that you should run at the middle to the top of zone 2 so you can get the most out of each aerobic run. However, my counter argument to that is that there's a reason you and I aren't professional runners, and a lot of it has to do with our capacity to train and absorb training load. From what I've seen, that's typically around 6 to 8 hours, or that 50 miles a week mark. What I think you should be trying to do is maximize the distribution of your capacity to train. So let's say that training load is 2 hard sessions across 5 days that equals 7 hours of running. You want to distribute your training load in a way that guarantees consistency across a chronic timeline, months on end, and that you can nail each and every one of your hard sessions and your long runs across these months, and that you can stand on the start line feeling fresh and energized, not hoping your rig's going to hold together and wishing you'd strung together a few more hard sessions. And I do believe that integrating a fair amount of slow running into a runner's program can help their long-term performance. Doesn't need to be every run, but next week, why don't you try 2 zone 1 runs, and you can label them on Strava as pro style. If you know, you know. So you look kind of legit running half your normal run speed. So what are some of the practical steps that we can implement from now? Number 1 is going to be assess your thresholds. You can assess your aerobic threshold by running in the middle of zone 2 and trying to hold a heart rate as steady as possible for 30 minutes. You can take a lap every mile or 5 minutes or K, and you can track that trend over time. Do it every few weeks and see if you can improve your pace or power output for the same heart rate. That's going to give you an indication of the progress of your aerobic capacity. To find your anaerobic threshold, you can do my 30-minute test and you can throw it into my calculator. Number 2 is monitor our training load. You can use Garmin's training status, Strava's relative effort, or something like Training Peaks' training stress score. We want to find out what is the training load of each of the different kind of sessions that we do. Our new zone 1 runs or our long run progressive hill repeats. We want to see what does that training load look like across each individual session and how does that look cumulatively across a week. We can then manipulate our training volume and intensity of those sessions so that we can find the maximal training efficiency. Number 3 is going to be listen to your body. Record a bit of subjective feedback after each run that you can compare it to your training load and figure out what works best and when soreness and tiredness and fatigue start to kick in at a certain training load, either cumulatively across weeks or specific sessions. Actioning these 3 steps is going to have you well set up to follow my 4-phase approach to marathon training. Hope to see you on the next one, and all the best with your next run. See ya.